The sun had barely crested the rolling hills when Jake heard the first scream. It wasn't human, but the sound of pain was unmistakable. His gut twisted as he dropped the feed bucket and sprinted toward the pasture. His boots pounded against the dry earth, heart hammering in his chest. Another agonized bellow tore through the morning air, sending a flock of crows scattering from the fence posts. Daisy. As he rounded the barn, the sight before him made his blood run cold. There, standing with a smug expression, was Karen, the self-appointed tyrant of the neighborhood HOA. In her hand, crackling with menace, was an electric cattle prod. She jabbed it into Daisy's side again, the blue arc snapping against the cow's thick hide. Daisy bucked, eyes rolling in terror, her massive body trembling. Jake didn't stop to think. He reached her in 3 long strides and snatched the prod from her hand with such force that she staggered back. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice came out low and sharp, edged with fury. Karen, unfazed, smoothed her floral blouse and gave him a condescending look, as if he were a child throwing a tantrum. "Handling a nuisance," she said, voice dripping with false authority. "This disgusting creature is ruining property values. It stinks, it's loud, and it doesn't belong here." Jake clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the stolen prod. He forced himself to take a deep breath. This woman had already made a reputation for herself, patrolling the neighborhood, issuing fines for minor infractions, terrorizing anyone who didn't conform to her vision of a perfectly manicured, soulless community. But this was different. "You just assaulted my cow," he said, his voice controlled but deadly. "That's animal cruelty." Karen scoffed. "Oh, please, it's just a farm animal. Besides, I was doing you a favor. I've already called animal control. They're coming to remove these things." She waved a hand toward the rest of his herd, grazing peacefully beyond the fence line. Jake's stomach tightened. He'd dealt with entitled people before, but Karen had just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. "First of all," he said, stepping closer, "this is private property, my property. Your HOA doesn't mean a damn thing out here." Karen's expression flickered, just for a second. She hadn't expected pushback. She was used to people backing down, rolling over, caving to her demands. "Not for long," she said smoothly. "We're working on rezoning the area. Once that's done, this eyesore of a farm will have to go. You should start looking for another place to." The rumble of tires on gravel cut her off. A white truck pulled up, the county animal control emblem shining on the door. Jake exhaled sharply, his rage simmering just below the surface. The officer who stepped out was a familiar face. Mark Townsend, an old friend, a guy who'd been to Jake's place a dozen times, sometimes to check permits, sometimes just to grab a beer. His eyes flicked between Jake and Karen before settling on the prod still clutched in Jake's fist. "What's going on here?" Mark asked, his voice wary. Karen stepped forward, all righteous indignation and faux concern. "Thank goodness you're here. This man is running an illegal farm within an HOA community. His animals are a health hazard, and I was forced to take action myself since he refuses to comply with regulations." Mark gave her a flat look, then turned to Jake. "That true?" Jake let out a short, humorless laugh. "Not a word of it. She trespassed, attacked my cow with this," he held up the prod, "and is now trying to strong-arm me off my own land." Mark sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Karen, you do realize this property is outside HOA jurisdiction, right? His land isn't subject to your rules." Karen blinked. That's incorrect. I've spoken to city officials. There are ongoing discussions about—" "No, there aren't," Mark interrupted. "Even if there were, you'd have no legal right to harass or harm his livestock." Karen's face flushed a deep, ugly red. "You have no idea who you're talking to," she hissed. "I know people in high places. I can have your job with one phone call." Mark raised an unimpressed brow. "That right? Well, feel free to call them while I file a report for trespassing and animal cruelty." Karen's composure cracked. Her mouth opened, then snapped shut. She turned to Jake, eyes burning with venom. This isn't over, she spat before storming past him toward her car. Jake didn't move as she peeled out of his driveway, dust kicking up in her wake. He let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders. He knew her type. People like Karen didn't back down. They regrouped, found another angle of attack. Mark crossed his arms. She's gonna be a problem. Jake nodded. Yeah, but now I know what I'm dealing with. Mark shook his head. You pressing charges? Jake looked out at Daisy, who was still trembling, his gut twisting at the thought of what could have happened if he hadn't arrived in time. Not yet, he said finally. I have a feeling she's not done. Mark nodded grimly. Then I'd keep an eye on her. Women like that don't lose quietly. Jake already knew that. And as he watched Karen's car disappear down the road, he had the distinct feeling that this was just the beginning. A week passed, and the ranch settled back into its usual rhythm. Jake kept a watchful eye on the fence line, but for the most part, things seemed quiet. Too quiet. Karen hadn't come back. Not in person, at least, but he could feel her presence like a storm brewing just beyond the hills. It was only a matter of time. The first sign came in the form of a letter. Official-looking, printed on thick paper with an embossed HOA seal. Jake read it over twice, his pulse tightening. It was a final warning for noncompliance, citing zoning violations and excessive livestock complaints. He smirked, shaking his head. The letter carried no legal weight, it was just a scare tactic. He tossed it into the fire. Then came the fence. He found it early one morning, a fresh line of wooden posts and taut wire cutting across the southern edge of his pasture. A section that had been open land for as long as he could remember. It was brand new, no dust, no weathering. Not his. Jake ran a hand over his jaw, studying it. She was testing him, pushing boundaries, literally. He climbed onto his ATV and followed the fence until he spotted the fresh concrete footings of a bold, gleaming private property. No trespassing sign. His stomach clenched. The sign bore the HOA's logo. He headed straight for the HOA office, a sleek building that looked like it belonged in a corporate plaza, not a small-town community. Inside, Karen sat behind a massive oak desk, sipping coffee from a mug that read, "Because I'm the boss." When she saw him, she didn't even feign surprise. "I was wondering when you'd show up," she said, setting the mug down with a smirk. Jake threw the letter onto her desk. "You've got no authority over my land. And that fence?" He jabbed a finger toward her window. "Better be gone by the end of the day." Karen leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "That land is under review for rezoning," she said smoothly. "Once it's approved, your little ranch will be in direct violation of HOA guidelines. You'd be wise to start making arrangements now." Jake scoffed. "You don't have the power to rezone anything." She smiled. "I have friends who do." There it was, the unspoken truth. Karen wasn't just a busybody with too much time on her hands. She had influence, connections, people in city planning who owed her favors. Jake held her gaze. "You're playing a dangerous game." Karen's smile widened. "So are you." That night, the first real damage happened. Jake found the fence cut open, strands of barbed wire curling on the ground like severed veins. The break led straight onto an HOA-owned walking trail, and sure enough, a handful of his cattle had wandered through, grazing peacefully near the neatly paved path. It didn't take long for the cops to arrive. Jake stood with his arms crossed as two patrol cars pulled in. He recognized the officer who stepped out. Daniels, a younger guy, new to the department. Not one of Jake's usual crew. Daniels adjusted his belt. "We got a report about loose livestock causing a public hazard." Jake glanced at the cows, then back at Daniels. "Looks more like peaceful grazing to me." Daniels sighed. "Sir, I just need to know if these animals belong to you." "Yeah, they do." "Then we've got a problem." Jake exhaled slowly. "You see that fence over there?" He pointed toward the break. "Someone cut it. That's why my cows are out." Daniels hesitated. This wasn't what he'd expected. Before he could respond, a familiar voice cut through the night like nails on a chalkboard. "Officer, I demand you issue a citation." Karen appeared from the walking trail, arms crossed, her face alight with triumph. "This is exactly what I warned you about. These animals are a liability." Daniels turned to her. "Ma'am, I'll need to file a report on how the fence was damaged." Karen's expression flickered, just for a moment. Then she waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, please. This is about the cows, not some old fence." Jake took a step forward, his voice even. "If this is about the cows, then I suggest you start looking for whoever let them out. Because it sure as hell wasn't me." Karen huffed. "This is absurd. Are you really going to let this violation slide?" Daniels shifted uncomfortably. He was caught between an HOA president with political sway and a rancher who had clearly been wronged. He chose the safest route. "I'll file a report and let the county sort it out," he said finally. Karen's face twisted in frustration, but she forced a smile. "Fine," she snapped, "but I will be escalating this." Jake watched her walk away, her heels clicking against the pavement. He didn't relax. He knew she wasn't bluffing. By morning, the HOA board had filed a formal complaint with the city, claiming Jake's cattle posed an environmental hazard. He received a notice of inspection, with a warning that any further issues could result in forced removal of livestock. Jake leaned against his truck, staring at the paper. Karen had resources, that much was clear. She wasn't just needling him anymore. She was trying to bury him in red tape, drown him in legal battles until he had no choice but to fold. But she had underestimated him. Jake wasn't just a rancher. He was a cop. And if Karen wanted to play dirty, then it was time he started playing smart. Jake spent the next few days watching, waiting. Karen had made her move, and now it was his turn. He didn't react, didn't storm into another HOA meeting or demand explanations from city officials. That was what she wanted, a fight on her terms, in an arena where she held all the power. Instead, he gathered information. The first step was the cameras. He installed them along his fence line, small, discreet, positioned where no casual passerby would notice. If Karen wanted to keep playing dirty, he'd make sure there was proof. The second step was digging into her connections. Jake had seen enough corruption in his time on the force to know that power wasn't always earned. It was traded, leveraged. Karen had friends in city planning, in the zoning office, but favors always came with a price. He just had to find out what hers had cost. The break came from an unexpected place. One afternoon, as he was fixing the damage to his fence for the third time that week, a car pulled up beside his property. The driver's window rolled down, and a man in a pressed shirt leaned out. Not a cop, not a neighbor, a journalist. Jake Mitchell. The man extended a card. "Ethan Cole. I'm an investigative reporter for the county paper." Jake took the card, but his expression didn't change. "Not interested." "You might be." Ethan rested an elbow on the car door. "I've been looking into HOA fraud cases. Your president, Karen Reynolds, her name keeps coming up. Zoning bribes, fraudulent citations, embezzlement." Jake kept his face unreadable, but something in his gut shifted. "You have proof." Ethan smiled. "Not yet, but I think you might." It took less than an hour for Jake to hand over everything. Copies of the bogus letters, the fence-cutting incidents, the trespassing. He gave Ethan access to the security footage from the past 2 weeks. If Karen thought she was untouchable, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. While the journalist worked on the bigger picture, Jake set his own plan in motion. He started small rumors carefully placed in the right conversations. A casual chat with a local business owner about HOA funds. A mention at the feed store about Karen's sudden rise in influence. People in small towns talked, and once doubt started spreading, it moved fast. Then came the cameras. Late one night, as he watched the feed from his laptop, he saw it. ***, Karen herself ***, stepping through the gap in the fence, a pair of wire cutters in her hand. She glanced around, unaware of the camera just above her head, then knelt to slice through the remaining strands. Jake sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had her. The next day, he paid a visit to an old friend, County Investigator Mike Lawson. A straight shooter, the kind of guy who didn't tolerate corruption, no matter how deep it ran. When Jake laid out everything, The threats, the false reports, the footage of Karen destroying private property. Lawson didn't hesitate. She's been on my radar for a while, Lawson admitted. We just never had enough to nail her. Until now. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Jake got a call from Ethan. The story was ready. A full exposé on Karen's abuse of power, complete with financial records, testimonials, and now security footage of her committing a crime. It would hit the papers and the local news in the morning. Jake leaned against the porch railing, phone pressed to his ear. You think this'll be enough to take her down? Ethan chuckled. By the time we're done, she won't even be able to fine a neighbor for leaving their trash cans out too long. Jake smiled to himself. For the first time in weeks, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. He glanced toward the pasture, where his cattle grazed peacefully, unaware of the battle that had been raging around them. Tomorrow, Karen Reynolds was going to wake up and realize her empire was built on sand. And Jake was going to enjoy watching it crumble. Karen always walked into HOA meetings like she was royalty, head high, smile sharp, a queen surveying her kingdom. But tonight, the room wasn't hers. The air was different, tense, charged. Neighbors whispered, eyes darting toward the front where she sat, oblivious to the noose tightening around her. She noticed the energy shift, the way people avoided her gaze, but she brushed it off. This was her domain. No one dared challenge her. Jake sat in the back, arms crossed, waiting. The newspaper had hit that morning, and by now half the town had read it. The headline alone had been enough to send the HOA board into a tailspin. HOA president accused of fraud, corruption, and vandalism. Exclusive evidence unveiled. Karen had spent the day doing damage control, calling in favors, spinning her usual lies. But this time it wasn't working. People had seen the security footage. They knew about the bribes, the stolen funds, the way she had bullied homeowners into submission. And now she was about to answer for it. The HOA secretary cleared his throat, shuffling papers with shaking hands. We're here to address recent allegations against our president, Karen Reynolds. Karen shot to her feet. Baseless allegations, she snapped. I want to know who. The door opened. A hush fell over the room as investigator Mike Lawson stepped inside. Flanked by two uniformed officers, he didn't waste time. Karen Reynolds, he said, his voice calm but firm. We need to have a word. Karen's face drained of color, but she recovered quickly, forcing a laugh. This is ridiculous. I am an elected official. You're a fraud, someone muttered from the crowd. The room erupted. Voices rose. Homeowners she had threatened, people she had fined for absurd violations, neighbors who had been too afraid to speak until now. Jake stood, walking slowly to the front. Tell me, Karen, he said, voice steady but sharp. When you cut my fence and tried to frame me, did you really think no one would find out? Karen's eyes locked onto his, dark with fury. You think you've won? She hissed. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Lawson stepped forward, holding up his phone. He pressed play. The room filled with the sound of Karen's own voice, recorded from a phone call Ethan had uncovered. I don't care what it takes. Just get rid of him, she was saying. If we have to make his land unusable, we'll make it happen. That farm is in my way, and I want it gone. A ripple of shock swept through the crowd. There it was, proof. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. You don't just have the HOA coming after you, Lawson said. You've been embezzling funds, Karen. We traced over $50,000 in misused HOA money, vacations, shopping sprees, personal expenses. Not to mention evidence of falsified reports to the zoning office. Karen let out a harsh laugh. You think anyone cares? I've done more for this neighborhood than any of you. You did more for yourself, Jake cut in. And now you're finished. The room was silent. The officer stepped forward, and for the first time Karen looked afraid. She backed up a step, shaking her head. No, you can't do this. Lawson pulled out the warrant. Karen Reynolds, you're under arrest for fraud, destruction of property, and harassment. The moment the cuffs clicked around her wrists, the tension in the room shattered. Someone clapped. Then another. The dam broke. The people she had ruled over for years. Asterisk asterisk bullied. Fined. Threatened asterisk asterisk. Asterisk asterisk cheered as she was led out the door. Asterisk asterisk. Jake followed her outside, stopping just short of the squad car. Karen turned, her face twisted with rage. "You think this is over?" she spat. "You think they're going to let some pathetic rancher win?" Jake smiled. "Karen, you never figured it out, did you?" He leaned in slightly. "You were never in control. You just thought you were." The door slammed shut, muffling whatever last insult she had left. The car pulled away, leaving nothing behind but silence. Jake let out a slow breath, the night air crisp and cool around him. It was over. His land was safe, his cattle undisturbed. He had won not just for himself, but for everyone Karen had tormented. By morning, the whole town would know. And by next week, Karen Reynolds would be nothing more than a cautionary tale about what happens when you push the wrong man too far.